I'm speaking with David Truskoff, who's written The Second Civil War, an examination of part of the civil rights movement. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you start the book with the March on Washington in 1963. Was that your first civil rights effort?
No, it wasn't. I first got involved with the civil rights movement, quote unquote, back in 1948, when a group of us veterans, scraping up whatever uniforms we could find, or whatever remnants of uniforms, we were going to march from Newark, New Jersey to Trenton, New Jersey, and demand an end to racism in the state, and in particular to racial hiring practices for state employees.
What were the practices?
Oh, there was awful discrimination at the time. I mean, trying to get a job with the state at that time, if you were African American, you had very little chance. It was terrible. We all had that problem in New Jersey, where we were aware of the problem, but not. I wasn't as aware of it until I started that march.
And describe the march. What happened?
Well, we didn't get very far. We were going to march from Newark to Trenton, and we started out. We were stopped by the state troopers, who told us that we would be impeding traffic. We didn't have the proper credentials. And we had a quick meeting, decided we were going to get beat up and maybe tear gassed and perhaps have to pay some kind of fines. There were no television cameras then. We invited the media, but I don't think anyone showed up. So we just decided to go home, and we gave it up. It was a terrible blow to a lot of us who felt awfully defeated.
And did you get involved with other things during the 50s?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I was. It was kind of difficult because I was very interested in jazz, and I met with and talked with a lot of jazz musicians. Eventually, wound up doing a jazz show, and that also cost me. You know, it was so difficult. If you talked about, you could talk about Dizzy Gillespie or Charlie Parker or whoever, or Billie Holiday or whoever, but just don't put it in the context of black and white. You know, that was an unwritten law in the broadcast industry. Well, that was very difficult for me to do, and it was very difficult for some of my guests to do. You know, we would talk about certain clubs that they could play and certain clubs that they couldn't play. Diz had a terrible situation in Canada once. He literally hit someone with his horn who called him a derogatory name. And it was very difficult not to get into that subject, and it was very difficult to keep the show going.
And were there protests up north that you were involved in?
Protests about civil rights? Oh, yes, there were. When we attempted to march from Newark, there was always hecklers. The media didn't show up, but somehow the hecklers did. We always knew there were infiltrators. But anyway, I can remember the hecklers shouting, "You see, we knew they were communists. They were communists. They're carrying pictures of Lenin." Actually, we're carrying pictures of William E. Du Bois. You know, he had the same goatee. They didn't know the difference. But the 50s were kind of quiet as far as I was concerned. There wasn't a lot to do out in the streets.
So why did you go to the March on Washington in '63?
Well, it was just a natural thing for me to do. I got the invitation. Bayard Rustin sent me an invitation, and I went, and I was so moved. You know, after the 50s, and we got to Washington, D.C., and there were hundreds of thousands of people, you know, all there for the same thing. It was overwhelming. I can still hear the beautiful voice of one of the singers and welcoming us there. And I marched for a while with a group from Mississippi, and I sat at the reflection pool with my feet in the pool. It must have been 90-some degrees that day, I remember. And listened to King's dream speech, and all the speeches that were going on. It was such a fantastic experience. I came home on a high, thinking, boy, maybe now we have the momentum. It didn't take long to discover that, that it was just a one-shot scene, and we have to start all over again.
And when did you go down south?
I went down south. I got the invitation from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to come to Selma, and it was, again, the one part that really moved me when I got there was the children. Ever since then, I have focused most of my efforts towards the children, towards the young people. I speak at high schools whenever I can, because they're the ones that made it move. Dr. King couldn't get a dozen people to attend a meeting in Birmingham after the bus boycott until the kids went out. And if you see the films that they play over and over about the dogs attacking the people and the fire hoses on them, and you'll notice most of them are very young. That's the first thing that struck me when I got to Selma was the energy, the enthusiasm, the commitment, and the courage of all those young people.
So this is March of 65?
March of 65, yes.
And there was a plan for a march from Selma to Montgomery, the capital?
Right. We were going to, the first time we weren't successful. First time was worse than when we tried to march from Newark, because I'm sure you've read about it or heard about it. The terrible beating on the bridge, trying to cross the bridge. It was turned back. That's when John Lewis got hit on the head so hard. He was having dizzy spells for a long time after that. And going back to the Brown Chapel to reorganize, we all felt that we're going to have to start all over again, that I had the same feeling like after Newark, that this was just going to defeat us. But then again, the kids, they came marching back in, singing and shouting. And then Dr. King sent invitations out to a lot of celebrities. White people started showing up. It changed everything, And as Leroy liked to point out, when those white nuns, took their place at the head of the line, then the sheriff knew that it was all over.
Now, a white minister was killed in those days, right?
Yes. A very sad situation. Forgive me. I haven't thought about that in a while, but I do get emotional. Reverend Reeb made the mistake of going into town, a mistake I almost made, by the way. Reverend Reeb went into town, and these cowardly thugs came up behind him and struck him a blow on the head. He never recovered. He was from Boston, and he didn't seem to understand the danger, First, I think he thought as a minister he was exempt or something, I don't know. And then he didn't realize what the South was really about. And the poor man, I don't think he expected anything like that.
Now, your job was on the security detail. What was that exactly?
Well, it's quite different than I was security on other marches, but this was quite different. There was this military atmosphere, because there was danger all the time. After the attempt of the bridge, after the murder of Reeb and little Jimmy Jackson, and it was more a military operation. We had to go out, for example, and scout areas where the tents were going to be put up to make sure there weren't any snipers in the woods or bombs planted. We always knew that Dr. King's life was in danger. As a matter of fact, We did discover a truck that pulled up alongside of where he was going to spend that night, and they had guns in the truck, and they were finally caught. Also, understand, we were by ourselves. We could not trust the local police. We certainly didn't trust the state troopers, and we certainly didn't trust the FBI. So we were kind of on our own, and we had to perform all the things that we thought the state troopers or someone else should be performing as security guards.
Now, most of your book is discussions and interviews with Leroy Moton. Why did you first pick him out to interview?
Well, I met Leroy rather early when I got down to Selma, and he was only 17. And Leroy was very active. He went out rounding up kids from outlying districts and schools and bringing them into town to march and sing, and I don't know, we just seemed to relate to each other. As I said, I was always so impressed by the young people, and he was certainly one of them. He was organizing groups to march, and he was assigned to transportation. It was a very difficult job because if you drove out of the Selma area, you had to, one, make sure you were driving speed limit. Two, make sure you had the proper credentials. You had your driver's license, you had the registration, because you were bound to be stopped. And they would stop you for any reason they could think of, particularly if they saw a mixed group in a car. So Leroy was involved in that, and we just worked together.
So the march made it to Montgomery.
Yes, we did. We made it, and it was a thrill. It really was. Leroy and I both went into the church, and I always said, you follow Leroy, you're bound to find food. And and we sat there eating fried chicken. We didn't bother listening to the speeches. But we felt proud as hell, that we accomplished that. And we knew, as Dr. King said, we knew that this was just the beginning. We had to keep the momentum going.
Did you know Dr. King? Had you met with him?
Oh, I met him a few times during the march, of course. We were shooting baskets one time in Greenwood, Mississippi. It's surprising. He wasn't, Dr. King wasn't a very tall man, but he had a great two-handed set shot.
Well, the march ends, and Leroy Moton and Viola Liuzzo are driving in the car. What happens then?
I was shocked. I didn't know it was Leroy at first. I was trying to get, I thought I'd get to Atlanta. I had to meet someone in Atlanta and then head back to New York. Just before I left for Atlanta, I heard that a white woman had been shot and murdered on Route 80, and I knew right away that Leroy was driving, her car. When I found out that Leroy was also in the car, at first, you see, the people who committed the murder thought that Leroy was dead. He pretended to be dead. He hit his head on the visor when the car hit the pole, and he knew they were coming down to look in the car. And when they said, "Oh, we got the nigger too," they thought he was dead because he had blood running down his face. And he finally managed to get a ride back. The part that angered us all the most was that they immediately took Leroy into protective custody. In a sense, they arrested him. Not only did they take him into protective custody, but they kept him in solitary confinement. And Jose Williams knew right away. Jose was a lieutenant of Dr. King. He's a very active guy, and a great guy, a war veteran. Anyway, Jose knew right away why they did that. They were afraid that Leroy could identify the killers because the FBI had an informer in the car, and they were concerned, the FBI was concerned, that Leroy could identify him. And so they didn't even let his mother come to see him, or anyone at first, you know.
So the authorities were not concerned about protecting Leroy, but they're protecting the killers.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's what happened. Well, as you know, the killers were finally brought to trial and walked out of that courtroom in Lowndes County, Alabama, free men, signing autographs, smiling and laughing. And the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover knew very well how guilty they were.
Talking about J. Edgar Hoover, in your book you have a short letter that he wrote. Could you describe it?
Yes, he was, as I said, my mother used to refer to J. Edgar Hoover as public enemy number one. The man was, one, a liar, and two, a hypocrite. What else can I call him? At any rate, he sent this memo that to the President of the United States that he felt there was a necking party going on between Leroy and Viola Liuzzo, and besides, she had needle marks on her arm, and that she was a drug addict, et cetera, et cetera. All the time, he knew who the murderers were.
Some of them did get some punishment later on, is that right?
Years later, through the great work of SCLC attorneys and Kathy Rohrbach, I'd like to mention her. She worked very hard in that area. Kathy, by the way, was the attorney who defended the Black Panthers in New Haven, you remember? They were tried on a civil rights charge. They couldn't be tried on the murder charge again. So they were charged on the civil rights problem, and they got minimum sentences. I think the max was 10 years, but I don't remember what the parole eligibility was.
Well, after the murder, you met up with Leroy Moton again?
Yes, we did. We had some wonderful reunions. I can remember one time I was in the grocery store shopping, and I glanced over and saw this white-haired man, and I couldn't believe it was him. He was in Bloomfield, Connecticut. And Leroy just stopped in his tracks and looked at me, and we shook hands and hugged each other. It was a great reunion, and I was to speak at the University of Hartford at the time, invited Leroy to go with me, and we just had a wonderful time.
Back in '65, you continued your audio tape interviews with Leroy.
Yes, Leroy tried to stay with it. You know, he worked with COFO, you know, trying to get students back down south and things, and all of that disintegrated. Dr. King was losing ground. Dr. King was changing. We had those awful riots and going on in various cities. Dr. King went to Chicago, as you probably know. Poor Leroy, he went expecting things to change, you know. And Dr. King was terribly defeated in Cicero, Illinois. The march was turned around. It disintegrated. But I think it all started breaking down well before that. It started breaking down in Canton, Mississippi, you know, where we got clobbered in Canton, Mississippi. And we were having the arguments between Black Power, the militants,
What was Black Power? What did that mean?
Stokely Carmichael was, that was his name at the time, Stokely Carmichael. He was working with young people in the South. And Black Power was a revolutionary phrase. Willie Ricks, who worked with the Reverend Willie Ricks, who worked with Stokely, was telling people where to get guns. It was a breaking away of the nonviolent movement. Stokely claimed you're never going to speak nonviolence to Sheriff Rainey's gun. And things began to tear apart. Dr. King would be speaking and people would be shouting Black Power. Dr. King once said, we were at Eno Dam, I remember, and Dr. King said, I'm not interested in Black Power or Green Power, which some of the people were calling for, and or white power. I'm only interested in moral power. And that's how he was trying to hold the group together. But it just crashed in Cicero.
Now, looking back at the Second Civil War, why do you call it that term, the Second Civil War?
Well, Selma, Alabama was where a great battle of the First Civil War was fought. One of the undefeated generals of the Confederate Army was sent to defend Selma, Alabama. They had the shipbuilding works there, and it was a very important strategic town for the Confederacy. 1 year later, the march began to cross the bridge in Selma, Alabama.
Well, you mean 100 years later?
Sorry, I'm sorry. I told you not to get old. 100 years later, the Second Civil War began. And it was a war. People were killed, Schwerner, Goodman, Jackson, Little Jimmy Jackson, Reverend Reed. People were killed, people were tear gassed, people were beaten. It was a war.
Who won?
Actually, we can still debate that. Part of my talk that I give very often is, did we win? And if so, what did we win? If I can go to Weaver High School in Hartford, Connecticut, and look out over a sea of old black faces as I speak, and then just go a few miles up the road to Simsbury High School and look out over an audience of all white students when I speak, did we win?